Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. We're going to talk a little bit about the romantic genre and its subgenre, which is Gothic literature and art. So when we think of Frankenstein, we usually think of this picture right here. This is, I think, from one of the earliest film versions of the story. And, I think it's easy for us as a culture to understand what Frankenstein is. We all have some sort of concept of the story. It's deeply ingrained in who we are as a culture. There are a lot of references to it. There have been many recreations of the story on the stage and through film. A lot of parodies and satires have been created based on this story of Frankenstein. It's all around us. And so Shelley writes this really thought-provoking story. And so we're going to talk a little bit about her and who she was, but also kind of try to bring to the surface some of the questions that she provided in her book that we should think about. The subtitle of the book is The Modern Prometheus. So as you read, think about that. How does the story of Frankenstein, how does that connect to the idea of Prometheus, which is the poem that we read earlier in the semester? Prometheus was a god who, was credited to creating mortals out of clay, but he was also the god who stole fire from the heavens. So it was divine, and he gave it to man, and he was punished for it forever. So Frankenstein is actually the name of the scientist, Victor Frankenstein, who created a creature. So this picture over here is a picture of the creature. It's not a picture of Frankenstein. So let's talk a little bit about Shelley. Here's Mary Shelley. She was born in 1797. Her father's name is William Godwin. He was like a political activist, wrote a lot of, pieces about government and politics and anarchy, things like this. He was a really well-read person, but he wasn't necessarily, living to the status quo of English society at this time. His wife was Mary Wollstonecraft, which is Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley's mother. So Mary Wollstonecraft was one of these first feminist writers in England, in the West, and she wrote a really, really well-known piece called A Vindication on the Rights of Women, which you guys will read next year in the senior seminar. But so Mary Shelley's parents were really well-read and educated. They had a lot of ideas. And, Mary Shelley's mom died really shortly after Mary was born. I think something like 11 days. She had some complications. And so Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, the young one, grew up not knowing her mother. And she only learned about her through stories that her father told her and through her mother's writings. And so, her mother advocated that women should have all the same educational opportunities and rights in society as men. And so she was responding to, some of Rousseau's ideas in that piece. And so Mary's father raised her and her sister Fanny, and he got remarried and had some other kids. And but Shelley was herself, these are her parents, William Godwin and Mary Wollstonecraft. Mary was not educated in the traditional sense of, going to school. She was educated in the home, talking about ideas, reading pieces, reading stories and works, and listening to many ideas. And so she's really smart. And so she grew up in this kind of turning point for women in culture. A lot of things were changing. And so she got to benefit from learning at home from some really well-read father. This young gentleman with the quill in his hand is Percy Shelley. It was this avid reader and scholar and knew young Mary, through her father. And Percy here and Mary met, and they had a scandalous marriage because Percy was already married. So they kind of had this affair and got married, ran away together. So, Mary Shelley was like 16 when this happened, and he was 22. Um, and his original wife was just heartbroken, and she committed suicide shortly after that. And so the whole thing was so scandalous that Mary and Percy just had to leave England. So they go to the continent, they go travel around Europe for a while. And people, talked about them. It was scandalous. People didn't forgive her. They didn't want to have anything to do with her, publish her works. Percy was writing poetry. I mean, we're going to read a lot of his stuff in the class. But people just wanted to shun them because what they did was just completely not acceptable. And so their relationship was fraught with a lot of turmoil just because of like how scandalous it was. So they had some children, but only one of them survived into adulthood. All the rest of them had died for various reasons at various ages. Mary Shelley and Percy lived in Italy for many years, where Percy was writing his poetry, and Percy Bysshe Shelley is one of the most famous English poets ever. We're going to read several of his pieces in this class. And he actually died a few years later. He drowned. And so his whole story, their whole story is just, in a sense, it is in line with the romantic sense about life. So we'll talk a little bit more about that, but, it ended tragically for them. And so Mary just had no way to stay in Italy, so she had to go home, back to England, reluctantly. She wrote a lot of novels and pieces, and she lived to a good old age. I mean, she was 53 when she died in London. And so that's kind of like a brief snapshot of her life. Now, I want to take you to the summer of 1816. We're in Geneva, Lake Geneva, which is there on the left. A beautiful place in the Alps, lovely crisp air, healthy air. A lot of doctors will send people to areas like this if they have some respiratory issues. And Europeans love to go to Geneva on holiday in the summer because the weather is just gorgeous. But in the summer of 1816, something really strange happened. This volcano erupted in Indonesia, and it sent this cloud of sulfuric ash all the way up into the northern hemisphere, and it covered Europe and beyond for that whole summer. And there are accounts, like primary accounts of people writing about that summer who said, we didn't even know what day it was because we couldn't really see the sun. Or it rained for days and days on end, which is really strange for this time of year. And so it was the summer of 1816. The Shelleys are traveling through Switzerland. And we read a piece the other day called A History of a 6 Weeks Tour, and that is the Shelleys' book. It's their account of traveling through Switzerland. And it was not, first class train tickets throughout the Alps. They were actually like throwing their bags into a boat and going down a river and hoping they could find a place to stay. They were young, they were broke, they had no money. And so they were living this big romantic adventure out in nature. And so they end up at the Villa Diodati, which is this mansion on the right. And they're there with this other premier English poet named Lord Byron and John Polidori. And they rented this house. The weather was bad, so they spent a few days together inside, and they were just creating stories. They were talking and creating. And one night they're sitting around the fire, and the story goes that Lord Byron challenged all of them to write a ghost story, and the next day they would sit around and read the story to each other. And so Mary Shelley's account of this was that she went to sleep and had a dream, and she dreamt about the creation of the creature, of Victor Frankenstein creating this creature out of body parts. And she was inspired by this idea of galvanism that Erasmus Darwin was playing with as a scientist, where he infused electricity into a worm and he saw it move. And so she thought in her sleep, she dreamt up the creature. Well, what if that is applied to human body parts. And so this is kind of the story of Frankenstein coming to life. And it all happened in that very strange summer on Lake Geneva in 1816. Here's a little bit about Lord Byron, because he's just so prolific. This young man, look at all these portraits of him. He was a lord, I think a baron. He's a little bit noble, but he was a romantic, and he was friends with the Shelleys and like William Wordsworth and these people. And we have a whole genre of hero that is based on Lord Byron, and this hero is also very prolific in our literature today. So, young adult novels have a lot of Byronic heroes, which are more of the moody, pensive, melancholy men in the story who feel like they are not understood by society, and so they're kind of a darker character in romantic literature. And so people like Heathcliff are based on this idea of the Byronic hero, and we get this from him. And he's young. I mean, these writers are really young, teenagers and in their 20s, and they were kind of the faces of this whole movement, which is it's completely fascinating. So here's a picture of Thomas Paine, just to kind of represent the idea of the Enlightenment and how the Romantic era, that the movements in literature and music and art were all responding to what was happening and what had been solidified through the Enlightenment. So this is Thomas Paine. He's holding a scroll. Well, you can't see it, it's cut off, but it's the rights of man. And these words around him are the injustices. They represent, he's defending the measures taken in revolutionary France. And he's trying to appeal to the English to overthrow the monarchy and organize a republic. So this is just kind of standing here to represent what the Enlightenment did. It actually was part of the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, etc. And so remember that the Enlightenment was a movement that was centered on the idea of our observation of the natural world around us, using logic, using reason, our observation, doing things like the scientific method. We had major increases in science and technology, and all of these things that are there to manipulate nature. And so Thomas Paine's just going to stand in for that idea. So the Romantics actually rebelled against that. Here's a picture we looked at last semester. This is Washington crossing the Delaware on the early hours of Christmas Day. The river's icy, and we questioned whether they should have done that. But we actually see this as a moment of great victory in the American Revolution. And so the American and French revolutions were calls for individual freedom and an overthrow of that rigid social hierarchy that we had in place. And then, of course, we had the Industrial Revolution happening concurrent and after this. And this was a new kind of social system that popped up. It challenged the agricultural societies that had been in place for so long. And we saw this in Charles Dickens' Hard Times. But there's a new working class, and they're restless, and they're worried, and they start doing things like forming unions, and the relationships between the workers and the union and the factory owners is really strained, and so all of this is happening. So then we have the Romantics. This is a little offshoot, a little reaction, a reactionary movement to the Enlightenment. Here's the picture, Wanderer above a sea of fog. And the Romantics took a different approach. They, instead of emphasizing reason and logic and science, these people were emphasizing what can happen through the emotions. If you just fully express every emotion. What about imagination? Imagination is actually the supreme faculty of man. It's not reason, like an Enlightenment thinker would think. And it's not the heart in the way that maybe like a pre-modern Christian would believe. So we're kind of painting a picture here for you guys to see how this is different. So an individual person is the unit of everything. So your own passion, your own existence, your inspiration. So here we have the lone wanderer. He's not up there with anyone else. So this is a major shift. The Romantics rejected the formal upper class way of doing things. So only certain people, like in France, there's something called the Salon, and it's where French artists of good reputation and high standing could display their works. And we see the Romantics kind of push in there, and they want to display their works too. And they're just normal people. And so we see that come to fruition in the modern era in about 100 more years. And so these writers would write works that address their own personal experiences, their own emotions, and usually the language is really simple. So the other day we read Mont Blanc, and it was pretty easy to understand. The language is just very, very simple. It's common. Anyone can read it. Romantics like to turn to the past or to an inner dream world. And that is thought to be more picturesque and magical than what's happening in the current world. So, for instance, this wanderer probably came from a village or a city where there's, factories and pollution, and there's no connection to the nature around him. And so Romantics said we need to return to nature like he's doing here. So individual liberty, rebelling against tyranny, being fascinated with nature, seeing nature as a force that can transform you. All these were ideas of the Romantics. So here's the oxbow. This is a Thomas Cole. This is a picture of Massachusetts after a thunderstorm. And this is a landscape painting. And this is kind of like a romantic panorama of the Connecticut River Valley. Excuse me, just after a thunderstorm. And stuff like this was not painted on huge landscapes. So this was very revolutionary in the art world. So this is very common. This is a romantic idea, common. Common scenes, common people. What did the normal people experience after a thunderstorm? Nature should be untamed. Let nature just have her thunderstorms and destroy those trees down there. And we'll paint a painting about that. It's not necessarily the same idea of beauty. Typical landscape artists probably wouldn't paint a broken tree like that. Here is Caspar David Friedrich, the same artist who did Wanderer Above a Sea of Fog. And this one's a little eerie. This is called The Abbey in the Oakwood. I'm putting this here to represent this subgenre of Romanticism called Gothicism. It's the Gothic genre. And nature can heal in Gothicism. Nature can destroy. Nature can destroy is more the bent of Gothic literature, is what I'm trying to say. So in a lot of Gothic art and stories, the weather is there to help us see what the mood should be. So if you read any Gothic story, there's usually something happening with the weather, and it's there for us as a symbol. And so sometimes we get like historical, picturesque settings, but the atmosphere is completely mysterious and gloomy. I mean, this one is so sad to look at. There are, headstones, and there are people down here going into the abbey. The abbey looks decrepit, falling apart. It must be winter. There are no leaves on the trees. This is just really sad. But there's something supernatural here because it's an abbey. So in a lot of Gothic art and stories, there's supernatural things happening, psychological plot elements. A lot of times there are violent, gruesome deaths. The settings are usually in, a medieval castle with secret passages and dungeons and towers to give that feel of coldness and mystery, what's going to be around the corner. And so we looked at this picture of Gothic architecture on the right. This is an abbey. And we have those like kind of knobby spires going up into the heavens. And on the left, we have a gargoyle. And so when it comes to architecture, Gothic architecture, we start seeing gargoyles on the outside of churches because they're scary. Out here in the world, we have sin. We are finite. There are things that are terrifying and bizarre, forces around us. And as humans, we should want to transcend that, excuse me, and reach the divine. And so So that gargoyle is not beautiful, it's grotesque. But the Gothic artists wanted to showcase we can actually be fascinated with the grotesque, and they were. Be fascinated with the unknown, with the frightening, the things that are inexplicable in the universe, and even in the human soul. And so the purpose of Gothic works is to create terror, put humans in confrontation with the forces around them, and I'm so sorry, and actually confront those things. And so Gothic literature shows people with this like ambiguous mixture of good and evil powers that they can't understand through reason. You can only understand it through your experience or your emotions. And so humans are a paradox to the Gothic artists. We're divided. It's like we have an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other, and it's constantly in conflict. And so a lot of Gothic stories will focus on human depravity and the struggle between good and evil. So we read a Gothic story last semester called Young Goodman Brown. And that same idea was here. Young Goodman Brown goes into the forest and he sees all the people who are reputable and holy in town, and they're in the woods and they're worshiping the devil. And so they have both elements of good and evil in them. And it's terrifying. So here are some common motifs in Gothic literature. These are kind of, markers for you as you start reading Frankenstein. All of this is going to be in there. So the first thing is the doppelganger. It's actually a German word that means double goer. So the doppelganger is like the alternate identity. Sometimes it's a physical twin, or a sibling or something like that. And Gothic doppelgangers often haunt and threaten the rational psyche of the victim to whom they become attached. So there's some sort of connection between the two. So to clear things up about the Scarlet Letter is a Gothic story. And so think about Chillingworth and Dimmesdale. They were paired in the whole story. And they were opposite. They were similar and they were different. And so they kind of represent a doppelganger. And so there's just a double motif. There's a comparison and contrast between the characters. And the purpose is to show those two opposing forces in human nature, your good and your evil. And so sometimes they're twins, they're siblings. It could be a husband and wife, a parent and child, a hero and a villain, or a creator and a creature. Hint, hint, hint. Okay, so here's Faust. We talked a little bit about Faust. This is the Faust motif that we see in a lot of Gothic stories, and that's the idea of trading your soul to the devil for something like forbidden knowledge, for power, for the love of a woman. This is showing a beautiful woman in the mirror. And so the Gothic hero has to question the universe's ambiguous nature, and they try to comprehend and control those supernatural powers that mortals cannot understand. So he tries to overcome his human limitations and make himself into a god. Okay? It's Promethean in a sense. This ambition usually leads to the hero's fall or destruction. We know it's never going to work out for good, but this motif shows up a lot. Another motif is a monster or a satanic hero, which is crazy to say. We're used to heroes being brave, self-sacrificial, but now in the romantic genre, we have things like the Byronic hero, and now we have a satanic hero. And sometimes they're referenced as like a fallen person. Okay, so they're isolated by their fall, and they either become a monster or they confront a monster who is his double. And so this is a motif you can look for. I don't remember what this picture is there for, and I didn't remove it before starting this video, so sorry. But this is going to stand here for this idea of a multiple narrative or spiral narrative, or we're going to call this like a frame story. So a lot of times stories are told through multiple tales, and there's usually like a frame around one. So for instance, The Scarlet Letter, which is a Gothic novel, is a frame story. It starts with the custom house story, and that person is there in the custom house and they say, I'm going to tell the tale of the Scarlet Letter. And then we go into the Scarlet Letter, which is the framed content. So the same thing's going to happen in Frankenstein. There's this frame story at the beginning that we see through the letters. Someone named Walton's going to be riding home and he's telling a story and they're serving as a frame. And then he hears another story and he says, I'm going to tell you that story. And then we go into the story. And in Frankenstein, at the very end, we actually go back out to the frame. So it starts and ends with Walton. It doesn't start and end with Victor Frankenstein, which is really interesting. So the purpose is to spiral us more in and in and in toward the truth. And then we come out of it. And it's supposed to captivate the listener. I mean, you guys are going to be captivated by these. All the stories that we read with a spiral narrative. This is... another motif, dreams and visions. Terrible truths are often revealed through dreams or visions because dreams and visions aren't usually logical. You can't reason yourself through them to make sense of them. So dreams and visions can actually reach you in another level. So hidden truths and knowledge of the universe or human nature can emerge in a dream or vision. So that's there. And we'll end on this. This is a piece from 1827. It's called From Northern Exposure. This is in the New York Public Library. During this time, people were fascinated with these unknown, unexplored places in the world where somebody had gone and they discovered, wow, this place exists. And maybe they wrote about it. It got published in a newspaper or pamphlet. They maybe, drew some pictures or something, and people were fascinated. Wow, there are places that we haven't been. And if you pair that with, all the advances that we've made in the West with technology and science, people were finding ways to get there. And so there were a lot of expeditions to the North Pole during this time. And we still have that. Scientists go to the North and South Pole to explore those regions. They're really hard to get to without specialized knowledge. And so this scene I'm putting before you because this is where Walton's letters at the beginning of Frankenstein start. They start in a place like this. Unknown. It's cold. It's icy. It's strange. Things are odd shaped and big. And we see nature is towering over that ship right there, which is in the theme of what we've been talking about with the art. So keep that in mind as you read. Here's a depiction of Frankenstein, pretty typical, the square head, the kind of out of proportion limbs. The same artist did this interpretation that's supposed to represent more of what that artist thinks he probably looked like, right? Just more proportioned features, but still terrifying. So here's just the art that we've looked at. We didn't look at that one. Here's the monk by the sea, out in nature. Chios, the parable of the wise and foolish virgins. View on the Stour near Dedham, which is a common, see those common people out on the water. The slave ship. Here's some other romantic artists. Francisco Goya, Spanish. His stuff's terrifying, but he is a top romantic artist. And here's some others down here if you want to, for your art portion of your Frankenfolio, if you want to look up some of these people and look at some different styles, feel free to do that. They'll help you. Okay, we're going to stop this there. Thanks for listening.